How cells harvest chemical energy. The name for this process is cellular respiration. In this, we're going to learn how organisms take the glucose molecules formed by plants, formed by photosynthesis, and turn them into major energy storage molecules called ATP. Before we get into the chemistry of cellular respiration, though, realize that breathing and respiration are related. Breathing is where your body and the body of other organisms take in oxygen into the lungs. That oxygen gets carried through the bloodstream to things like your muscle cells. The muscle cells are carrying out cellular respiration. When that cellular respiration happens, carbon dioxide is produced, and that carbon dioxide gets released from the body, also through breathing, when you exhale. So, to review, muscle cells get their oxygen from breathing, sugar from food, and they use that to produce energy during cellular respiration. Respiration is a series of reactions where fats, proteins, and carbohydrates, we learned earlier that those are macromolecules, mostly glucose, are broken down to make carbon dioxide, water, and energy. The chemical reaction occurs like this. Recall that reactions have two parts. The reactants are the ingredients needed for the reaction to happen. And in this case, for cellular respiration, the reactants are glucose and oxygen. And products. These are the molecules produced by the reaction. For respiration, these molecules are carbon dioxide, water, and energy. They're separated. The reaction is separated by an arrow that points toward the products. How efficient is cellular respiration? Well, if you look at just simply burning glucose, you get 100% of the energy from glucose is released as heat and light. If you look at the energy released from glucose when you are burning it, in quotes, during cellular respiration, you get about 40% of its energy. But if you compare that to a car, which is converting the gasoline energy into mechanical energy or movement, you only get 25% of a conversion rate in order to fuel your car. So cellular respiration is more efficient than using gas to fuel a car, but less efficient than simply burning it straight out. Here's an overview. These reactions proceed the same way in plants and animals, and the process is called cellular respiration. The overall reaction is 1 molecule of C6H12O6, that's glucose, plus 6 molecules of oxygen, yield 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of water, and many molecules of ATP. This is the transformation of chemical energy in food into chemical energy that your cells can use in the form of ATP. ATP, we know, is called adenosine triphosphate, and it has 3 parts: the adenine, the ribose, and the 3 phosphate groups. Most of the energy from cell respiration is converted into ATP. Not all of it, but most of it. ATP is the substance that powers most of the cell's activities. We talked about mitosis, we talked about active transport. The energy to fuel these things is coming from ATP. You get energy by breaking the bond between the last 2 phosphates of ATP. So how does that bond breakage happen? You need an enzyme in order to break the bond. It's called ATPase. This makes ATP into ADP, turns the triphosphate into a diphosphate, which means we took away 1 phosphate group. To remake the ATP, you have to use a different enzyme. This is called ATP synthetase. During cellular respiration, the breakdown of glucose begins in the cytoplasm outside the mitochondria. So the glucose enters the cell and it immediately starts breaking down. Remember that the glucose is made of 6 carbons. C6. Then after that original glucose molecule is broken down, the smaller molecules enter the mitochondrion, enter the liquid part of the mitochondrion to break down even more. In this slide, you see the matrix is the part in between the folds. It's the liquid stuff. It's comparable to the stroma, which we talked about in the chloroplast for photosynthesis. The cristae are the actual folds inside the mitochondrion. In the matrix, you get the 3 carbon pieces that happen before, when glucose breaks down into 2 smaller parts. Those 2 smaller parts are each made of 3 carbons. Those are called pyruvate. Those are broken down into carbon dioxide and water. And then the cristae is where the ATP is actually made. So the first part, you can think of cellular respiration as happening in 3 parts. The first part happens outside of the mitochondrion. Then we go inside the mitochondrion and we have another part of it happening in the matrix, which is the liquid part. And then we have the last part happening in the cristae, which are the folds. That first part that happens before the molecules enter the mitochondrion is called glycolysis. This is a series of reactions which break the 6-carbon glucose molecule down into 2 3-carbon molecules called pyruvate. So you take a molecule that has 6 carbons and you essentially break it in half. You end up with 2 molecules that each have 3 carbons. This process is an ancient one. All organisms from simple bacteria up through complex humans perform it the same way. And this process yields 2 ATP molecules for every 1 glucose molecule that they break down. So you get a tiny little bit of energy just from this very first step of glycolysis. Not a lot of energy. You'll see later that we get a lot more ATP from the other parts of cellular respiration. But it starts with this simple, basically breaking in half the glucose molecule. It yields 2 NADH, which are enzymes, per glucose molecule. So here's step 1 in picture form. Glucose up here enters the cell, and before it gets to the mitochondrion, it breaks down into 2 parts. Those 2 parts are each called pyruvate. Pyruvate then has 2 choices, depending on what is present in the cell. If there is no oxygen present, it goes into anaerobic respiration. If there is oxygen present, the pyruvate goes into the mitochondrion and goes through aerobic respiration. In glycolysis, glucose is broken down into pyruvate, making some ATP. This happens in the cytoplasm, and pyruvate can go one of 2 ways, either aerobic, which means with oxygen, or anaerobic, which means without. At this point, we kind of see that life, the type of organism you have, diverges into 2 forms and 2 pathways. You've got anaerobic cellular respiration, which is otherwise known as fermentation. This is what happens in yeast. Or you've got aerobic cellular respiration. We're going to look at anaerobic respiration first. Again, this is also called fermentation. Here's your choices again. Glucose enters the cell, breaks down in half, turns into pyruvate. Pyruvate can go through fermentation where there's no oxygen, which produces ethanol or lactate. Or pyruvate, if there's oxygen present, can go into the mitochondrion and go through the citric acid cycle, which we will talk about later. Anaerobic cellular respiration. Some organisms thrive in environments with little or no oxygen. Think about the things that live where there is no oxygen. Marshes, bogs, the gut of animals, like their stomachs, sewage treatment ponds. Sewage treatment ponds rely on these organisms to break down the sewage so that the water can be reused. If it's no oxygen's being used, it's called anaerobic. It results in no more ATP. The final steps in these pathways serve only to regenerate the NAD+, so it can return to pick up more electrons and hydrogens in glycolysis. So basically, fermentation is a quick process. You get those 2 ATPs from the glycolysis, and then you basically just go try to do glycolysis over and over and over again. You do have some end products, such as ethanol and carbon dioxide. Single-cell fungi, like yeast, this is what's going on when you produce beer or bread. Or, if you're in muscle cells, you get lactic acid. Fermentation is when oxygen is not present. This is used in making alcohol. Lactic acid fermentation is where pyruvate is converted to lactic acid, which is what makes your muscles burn after exercise. In aerobic cellular respiration, you have to have oxygen, and you get 2 more sets of reactions that occur in a specialized structure within the cell called the mitochondrion. Those 2 sets of reactions are the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. I know this seems a little complicated, which is why we did photosynthesis first. But just remember, for cellular respiration stage 1, you need to know about glycolysis. Glycolysis is the breakdown of the original glucose molecule. It breaks it down into 2 molecules called pyruvate. Each molecule has half the number of carbons. And then that pyruvate can go on, depending on if there's oxygen present or not, to do either fermentation or the rest of aerobic cellular respiration. If you have any questions, as always, you know how to get a hold of me.